Alright, welcome back to the course. I hope that after the last section, you now feel more like a real pro developer. So now that you know all about SASS and that you have your development workflow all set up with automatic SASS compilation and browser reloads, it's time to actually continue working on the Natures project, right? Are you excited about that? That's awesome, because that's exactly what this section is all about. So you're gonna learn a ton of new CSS features, build amazing animation effects, and become familiar with advanced techniques to style your own pages. You're gonna write like 1,000 lines of code and make a lot of progress while working through all these lectures. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, so let's get back to it right now. The first step in moving on in our project is to actually convert the CSS code that we've been written so far to SASS code. And so we're going to set up a couple of variables, and we're also going to nest selectors where that makes sense. And so here we are back in our SASS code. And actually we already have a lot of variables here going on, so mainly with the colors, but let's see if we can find some more. So I think for the colors, we already have variables for everything, right? I don't really see another color going on here, or actually here is black. So why not also having a variable for black? So color black. Because again, later down the road, we may decide that the black that we want is not really complete black, but maybe only some really dark gray. And then we would have to change all of that manually. And so it's better to always have a variable so that we can change it very easily and very quickly. And so now I can replace it here, color black, and of course the same thing here. Now again, doing so with the RGBA and then defining a hexadecimal color in here only works with SASS. So in regular CSS, we really have to define the colors here separately for R, G, and B with a number ranging between 0 and 255, such as we had before. But now in SASS, we can put a hexadecimal number here, like we have with the black color, and then the RGBA function is still going to work. All right, and there are no more color variables here. Now some people like to go really crazy here and also specify variables for all of this stuff, like family, weight, line height, and all of that. But I think that's not really necessary, because in fact we're only ever specifying this code once here. So not having this Lato font family all over the place. It's really just here. And so in fact, we're only defining it in one place. And so there's no need to have a variable. All right. Now remember that we're still having here in the background this terminal running, where it's still detecting all the time if we're doing some changes to our SASS code. And then each time we change anything, it actually reloads the page, right? And so all of the changes that we did already should be reflected in here. And so during the development of this entire project, I will just keep this running here in the background, and we don't have to worry about this anymore. So this is our development setup. And now that we have our variables set up, at least for now, let's take a look at nesting our selectors. So remember that we're using the BEM methodology, so a block element modifier. And so we're using all of these really low specificity selectors. So we have header, header logo box, header text box, and so on and so forth. And so when we select these elements, we always do this just with the class selector. And so all of our selectors, they're really just only one class selector with one class. So they all have the same specificity, which is extremely low. Also, since each and every element actually has a class, nesting can be a bit difficult here, right? It looks like there is not much to nest here, right? It's different from the example that we had when we first looked at SASS, where we did simply nest all the elements. Like we had, remember, UL, and then in there we had the LI, and then in there we had the A. So right now we don't have that kind of structure because every element has its own class. But still, we can do nesting here. And I'm going to show you how. And this is how we do it. So remember what the ampersand operator does? It copies this selector here that we have up until this point, right? So actually all of this. So it's dot header. So if we now want to specify this declaration block here, we can actually write it this way, logo box. And that's it. So we copy the code in here, and here we go. So this is now nested inside each other, and the code, when compiled, will be exactly the same. Because again, this header here, it's like it's copied here. So imagine that we copy it, and then we paste it here, and so it looks exactly the way we had before, right? And so instead of having to write header all the time in each single element that we want to select, we can just use nesting like this. So let's put these all together here, all of these which have to do with the header. So it's all of these. And then we can just replace the header with the ampersand operator. Now here in Visual Studio Code, when I select something and then hit Command D, it will automatically select the next instance, which is the same. So you see here I have header selected, and you see that already down here it's becoming with a different color, and now if I hit Command D, then it also gets selected. And you see these two cursors here blinking. So we have multiple cursors now, and if I now write the ampersand, it will replace both of them. Alright, so again, this is not really a CSS feature, but it's a feature of this text editor, and I know that Atom does this as well, and probably also brackets, and I know that Sublime Text also does it. And so you can try to figure out how your text editor does this trick. It's really handy sometimes to replace multiple instances of the same text all at the same time. Alright, and so that's it. So I really like this approach with nesting the selectors like this, because you see it's like really all encapsulated, all in this big one header block, okay? So when scanning down our code, we can see, okay, this is the header, then inside we have this declarations for the header, and then from there we move down to this element logo box, logo, and text box. Okay, so let's save this and let's actually take a look at the style CSS. And so here you see that actually what I explained you is exactly what is working. So you have the header declaration block, which starts here, ends here. Then we have the header logo box, the header logo. So exactly what we had before doing this nesting, right? So we change this in the SASS, but it looks exactly the same in the output. So this is what we wanted. Now the next thing here with the heading primary. So we can do the same here, right? So let's actually do it. And all we have to do is to basically, not that much code. Oh, this is really fast. So cut this one and put it in here. Because this is heading primary main, so this is the modifier here, right? And so now here, such as we had before, I can replace it with the ampersand. And that's actually it. So it will be heading primary dash dash main, and here dash dash sub. Alright, makes sense? So again, it's this nicely encapsulated block, which now contains all of the code for the heading primary, all at the same time. And we can now do the same thing here with the button, of course. So we have button link, visited, hover, active. So these for pseudo classes, and then here this modifier, and then this pseudo element, and we can wrap them all into one huge block, okay? So how do we do that? And actually I want you to do it. So it's a small challenge here. So pause the video and try to nest all of this code into one huge block. Maybe it's not exactly easy at this point, but it's a nice challenge, and so I hope that you can manage to do it. Hopefully you managed to do that. So let's now take a look how I would do it. So actually, let's start by just writing button here, and then start by copying all of that in there. Okay, and so now we can just remove this here, and such as again, replace this with the ampersand operator. And now I will start hitting Command D to select all of these button instances, okay? So button, button, and there's more button, button. Okay, and that's it. And so now replace all of these with the ampersand. Okay, so we have now button linked, button visited, button hover, button active, button white, and button after, and button white after, and button hover after, and button animated. Okay, but this is still not perfect, right? Because we can do more. We can also replace this part here because it's already here. Make sense? So we can just do it like this. Copy this entire thing in here and take this out. Okay, makes sense. So let's try to read that. So here we have, this will translate to button dash dash white, and then here it will translate to button dash dash white, and then the after pseudo class. Okay? Does it make sense? Now we can do the same thing in here. So let's go to the hover part, which is up there. And put it here. All right, so again, this was repeated, this part, right? So let me put it back very shortly. So this was already here. So why write it again? We can just take it out and replace it with the ampersand operator here. And so this is going to translate to button hover after. And I think that now we're good. Now everything is nicely nested in. I think it makes a lot more sense like this. It's easier to read, and it's all encapsulated in this small block that we have. Now I know that it may take some time to get used to this nesting and to make sense out of it, but you'll see that with practice, and maybe with all the practice that you're going to take while we're building this project, after that it will make sense to you and you will be so used to it that it's no problem anymore. Just one last final check to see if everything is still working. And yes, it is. So our button works exactly the same as before. So all the logic was preserved even after we changed all of this code here, okay? So that was my goal for this lecture. So we're now ready to move on. With our code now nicely organized with some variables and nesting, we're now ready to implement the CSS architecture that we've been talking about earlier. And what I mean is a 7-1 pattern, where we create 7 folders and one main SASS file to import all the files that are in these folders. So let's start by creating the base folder, which is where we're going to put our basic project definitions. So like a project boilerplate. So new folder, base. Okay, so all of these folders are going to be inside of the SASS folder, of course. Now inside of this base folder, we should have a file which is also called base. So a base SASS file. And this file will be for the real low-level basics, such as resets and styles for the HTML and body element selectors. Now this file should be a partial, so that we can later import it into the main SASS file. So remember the first lecture ever that we had about SASS? Back then I talked about partials and imports. And so that's what I'm meaning here. So the partial files, they always start with an underscore. So like this. And if I want to call this file base, then I just have to write underscore base.scss. And that's it. So now this is a partial SASS file. Okay? And so let's actually import it into our main file. And I will put it here at the top. And all we have to do now is simply write @import and then the path to the file. So it is in the base folder, right? Because remember, we are in the main file, so we are here in the folder system. And so from here, we just have to move into the base folder, and then from there, we select the base file. And now we don't have to use the underscore. All we have to do is base. So no underscore and no SCSS. This is enough for SASS to understand what we want to import here, okay? And that's it. Now some other files that we usually want in the base folder are files for animations. So animations.scss. Then we usually also have a file for typography. So typography.scss. And so we're going to fill all of these files over the next lectures, okay? And another one for utilities as well. And again, you'll see in one of the next lectures. So utilities.scss. And that's enough for the base folder. and they keep opening up here, but we can just close them. This one as well. All right. Now, once you see the whole picture with all of the folders and all the files, then everything will fall into place and make more sense to you. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this architecture is really designed to handle large, multi-page websites or web apps. And so maybe for a small landing page, like the project that we're working on here, this might seem like a bit too much, a bit overkill, right? But once you start working on a really huge project, then you'll appreciate how this really makes things easier, okay? So it's really important to have an architecture like this in place, especially when we're working on a larger project. Okay, but let's move on and create another folder here. And this one is called Abstract. And in this folder, we're only going to put code that's not going to output any CSS. So we already saw what type of code is that. So variables, mixins, and stuff like that. So let's actually put these files in here. And now to make my life a bit easier, I will actually do it using the command line, okay? But you, of course, if you don't like the terminal already, you can do it by hand in your code editor. I will just move to SASS and then Abstract. And then I will use touch to add some files here. And on Windows, you can use the edit command. So as I was saying, the files that we want here is for variables, for mixins, and for functions. And you can see that I can write all of these files that I want to create here in one line in the touch command. So here are these 3 files that I just created, right? All right, next up, let's create a components folder. And in that folder, we're then going to create one file for each of our components. And remember that components are our reusable building blocks that make up our websites or apps. And they should also be usable anywhere on the page so that they are completely independent and held together by the layout of the page, right? So let's create that folder. Components. And for now, we're going to leave it empty because we don't really have a component yet. Well, actually we do have, but let's worry about that later, okay? So this is the components folder. And remember that the components are held together by the layout of the page. And since I was talking about layouts, we also need a layout folder for each piece of the global layout of the entire project. So in the layout folder, we're going to have a global footer, header, etc. So stuff like that. So mkdir layout. So remember that this architecture is designed for multi-page projects. And so these layout elements should work everywhere and on all pages, right? So again, our components are our building blocks, which are independent and reusable everywhere across our website. And then the layout is what holds all of these components together. But again, we're going to see how that works when we really dive deep into the project. Now, if we have very specific styles for a specific page, like for example a home page, we can then create a new file for that specific page, and we do that in the pages folder. So mkdir pages. And that's actually what's going to happen in our case, because we can treat the landing page that we're building as like the home page, and there will certainly be styles that are only going to apply to that page. And then later on, if our fictional company will expand and add more pages, then they can have different styles for the other different pages. So let's actually create that one. So pages and then touch home.scss and go back. And so these are the most important folders that we're going to use the most. But you see that we only have 5 folders so far, so there are still 2 missing. So the 7.1 architecture also has a folder for themes in case that you're doing like a web app with different themes. And there's also a vendors folder where you can put third-party CSS, like for example the CSS file of a Bootstrap or an icon system or an animation framework, all right? But for now, we're going to leave these empty in this project. Now, what we have to do is to, of course, import all of these files here into the main file, right? So for now, we don't have much here, but let's now import what we have. And actually, I'm just going to copy this one. So for the base, we have animations. Actually, it's once more. So animations, base, typography, and utilities. All right. Now in the abstract, which actually comes before, so let's put it before here. So import abstracts and then functions. And let me just copy this entire mixins and then variables. All right. So abstracts, base, components is still empty, so nothing there, layout as well, and now pages. So import pages and home. So what I suggest we do next is to actually sort all of this code into different files, because the goal is that in the end, this main file only serves to import all the other files. So there will be no code here in this file except for all these import declarations, okay? So let's put all of this code where it belongs. So these are variables, and we know that there's a file just for that. So that's it. And let's see if our SASS already compiled here. Well, it seems like something is going wrong here. Well, let's just close this one and try it again. Okay. Actually, we can do it here. Clear. And remember how it works? We just have to write npm run and then the name of our script that we wrote here. So it's called compile and SASS. So compile SASS. And now it's waiting for that we make some change here, because of this W flag here, it only works on changes. So let's just change something here. I don't know. We can just, yeah, like delete this from here actually. And so save it and let's see what it does. And so yeah, so here we go. Now it's working again. And this should be reloading automatically. And so you see that it still works, which means that our import here was successful. We can actually check it out here as well. And yeah, so everything is still working just fine. So this is our variables file, and we're going to add a lot of variables in here over the next lectures. But for now, let's close it, okay? So these things here, they are going into the base file, okay? So base, because they are the basic definitions about our entire project. Next, we have this animations file here, and we have some animations here, right? So let's put them in there. So keyframes and all of this code. So now it's all nicely separated. Whenever we want to see an animation, check out how they work or change something, we already know all we have to do is to go into this animations file. So great. Now the button, and actually we can say that the button is a component because it's certainly a block, and so we can call it a component. So it's reusable across the page, it's independent, it works everywhere, and it's a building block that we can use wherever we want on our page. So let's actually create a new file here in the components, okay? This time I'm going to do it here in the editor. So button.scss. I'm going to put the code in there. So the entire button code goes here, okay? And now, of course, never forget that we have to import it, right? So base and then components. So here, import okay. And so now we imported this file. We can close it. So what else do we have here? We have the header. Now the header, I'm not going to treat as a component. I'm actually going to treat it as a layout element. So we know that probably on each page that we'll have in this website. So once again, imagine that the website is going to expand, and then on each page we're going to have this header, right? And so this is a layout. So let's add a file here in the layout for the header. Header.scss. Okay. Now, this is a bit subjective, of course. I mean, there's no right and wrong in how you divide your code. So if you will say that this is a component, then maybe you're not wrong, and you can, of course, then go ahead and create a component for this code. But I think this is better organized as being an element of our layout. So it's simply just a question of how we name things here, but I like to say that it's layout, and so I create a file in the layout folder. And then of course I have to include it in here as well. So import, so layout, and then header. Now all of this process might seem a bit cumbersome to you, a bit boring and a bit too much work. But of course, ideally, you start by doing this right from the beginning. You don't start to write your CSS the way we did it, and then you sort everything into these folders. No, ideally, you start right from the beginning of the project by having this organization, this architecture, right? This is just because I didn't want to start the course with this difficult stuff, with this more confusing stuff. I just wanted to start the course with coding. And so now we have to quickly go through this process and convert everything to this new architecture, okay? Now what else do we have? The heading primary. Oh, and actually that's it. So the heading primary, I will classify it as being an element of our typography, okay? So let's open this typography here and put this here. So again, you could argue that this is a component, and I couldn't say that you're wrong, but I like to organize this piece of code here into my typography file, because it's really related to typography in this case. And so this seems the most intuitive place for me when I will be looking for the heading. All right, and something else that we should do is if we look at this base here, you will see that we also have a lot of typography stuff in here. So actually we should move this to typography. So everything that is typography related, we should have right in this file. So this entire code here, not all of the code, but everything except this one here, should go to the typography. So everything except this part. And so then here, we just delete everything except this one. Okay, so everything that is related with typography is now in here. So let's close it. And now you could argue once more that this font size here is also for typography. And while I also agree with that, we saw before when we did our conversion to rams that this acts more like an overall setting for how we size our entire page, right? So I don't see this as much as typography. I see this more like really a base definition, a global definition, which defines what one rem should be. Let me actually write it down here, okay? This defines what one rem is. And that's why I'm going to leave it here, because that's what it is really. So we have a reset here, and this box sizing is actually also part of it. And then here this overall one rem setting is also here in our base. So we have base animations, we have typography, then we're gonna add some utilities here later. We already have one component, we have one piece of the layout. Homes is still empty by now. Variables, mixins, and we don't have any mixin yet, and also no function. So let's leave them empty for now. So this package JSON, I can also close it, this one as well, this one. And okay, so don't need any of this. And all right, so that is our architecture. So again, you might not need all of these different files and folders for a really small project like this one. But I really want you to get used to this structure, because if you don't organize your SASS files like this, if you just have a bunch of unrelated files or even everything in just one file, it will become a real nightmare when you someday have to maintain all this code. Imagine that you have 10,000 lines of code one day, and then you want to maintain all of this. You want to change something very deep in the code, and then it will be really difficult. So it's always best to start this from the beginning and then keep using the system all throughout the project. And that's what I wanted to show you in this lecture and overall in this entire course, really. Because I've been talking a lot about maintenance and all that stuff because it's really important for a professional CSS developer like you want to become. Alright, now before we start really building the rest of the Natives project, let's just quickly review the 3 basic principles of responsive design. I'm pretty sure that many of you are already familiar with these, but I want to make 100% sure that we're all on the same page before diving deep into this project. So the first, let's say, ingredient for responsive design is to use fluid grids and layouts. And what this means is that we use percentages rather than pixels for all layout related length, and especially width. We do this, of course, in order to allow the content to easily adapt to the current viewport that the user is using to browse the website. The next ingredient are flexible and responsive images. It's necessary to mention this aspect because images behave a bit different than text content, because they do not scale automatically as we change the viewport, and so we need to ensure that they also adapt nicely to the current viewport. Usually we make images flexible by defining their dimensions in percentages, rather than fixed units like pixels. Plus, images usually make up the biggest part of our website's size in terms of megabytes, and so we should optimize the images for different width, which is something we're going to do later when we talk deeper about responsive images. Alright, and the last piece of the puzzle, because fluid grids and layouts and flexible images alone aren't enough, are media queries, which allow us to change styles on certain viewport width, which are called breakpoints. So basically, media queries allow developers to create different versions of a website for different types of devices, okay? Now, moving on and taking a closer look at the first aspect that we talked about, so fluid grids and layouts. In modern web design, there are currently three major ways of laying out a web page or app. So, for a long time, we have been using float-based layouts, where we simply put a bunch of boxes side by side using floats. Simple as that. This method is still being used in 2017, and it's still how I personally lay out my designs today. And that's because the alternatives are still not 100% supported by all browsers. So about these modern alternatives, I'm talking about Flexbox and the even more modern CSS grid technology. And you probably heard of these, right? So while Flexbox offers an amazing way of laying out elements in a one-dimensional row, CSS grid is perfect for creating the overall layout of a page in a fully fledged 2D grid, so a two-dimensional grid. These are great technologies, as I was saying, and they will make our life a lot easier in the future. But as of 2017, I'm not sure we should use them in production. The thing is that the layout is the single most fundamental aspect of our design. And so if a browser does not support a technology like Flexbox or CSS Grid, then that's a major problem and can ruin our entire designs if we choose to only rely on these new technologies, of course. So for all these reasons, we're going to use float layouts for this project, simply because this is still used everywhere and will be used for a long time, and so you need to really know how it works. But since you bought the most advanced CSS course on the market, you will of course also learn Flexbox and CSS Grid. Not in a native project though, but in future projects later in the course. So the next project will be about Flexbox, and the third and last project will be with CSS Grid. So moving forward in the future, you will always have to know how to use all of these three layout types, because that's really where CSS is moving right now. For the ones of you who are familiar with JavaScript, this is a bit like the older JavaScript versions and ES6. These days, you really need to know both JavaScript versions, because even with ES6 around by now, you're still going to see lots of the older ES5 around for a long time. Alright, and that's enough for one lecture. See you in a second in the next video. Back to coding. So we talked about layout types. Now let's actually go build a float layout. And in order to do so, you will learn how to build your very own simple fluid grid that you can use on a small web page like this. And so in this lecture, you're actually going to learn a bunch of new stuff. Firstly, how we should architect and build a simple grid system. And in order to do that, you'll learn how the attribute selector works, how the powerful not pseudo class works in CSS, and how the calc function works. And also what's the difference between calc and simple SASS mathematical operations. So a lot for one lecture, so let's get our hands dirty now. Now, before we start, what is a grid actually? Well, a grid is just a design system which allows us to build consistent interfaces. So this kind of grid will allow us to divide our available space in 2 equal parts, in 3 equal parts, or in 4 equal parts, or even something like this, with 1/3 on one side and 2/3 on the other side. And this leads to way more consistent designs, and so now it's really become like a standard in web design. So everyone really uses a grid like this. You also see that there's a consistent space here between all of these columns, so we always have this space here, which is called the gutter actually. And so once again, the grid is designed to allow us to build consistent interfaces. So here you can see all the different elements that we're gonna have in our very small grid. So we have one configuration with 2 columns here, then we will have a configuration with 3 columns, like these ones here, and then one configuration with 4 columns, okay? Now if you wanted to do more, like 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, or even more, then the logic that we use here for these columns is the same, like extending it to even more columns. But for this example and for this project, 4 different columns is more than enough. Now in the 3-column configuration, we also have this column here, which actually spans over 2 of the single columns. So you see this one here spans over these 2 here, right? And so we could then put 1/3 on this side and 2/3 on the other side, if that's a layout that we want to build. And then for the 4-column configuration down here, we have one column that spans over 2 of these. So this one here spans over these 2 basically, in case you need a layout like that. So for example, 1, 1, 2, or you could have 1, 2, and then 1 again. So to have a bigger column in the middle, like this one. And then finally, we also have a column which spans over 3 of the individual columns here, which is this one. So these are all the different configurations. Now the columns, they always should be in a container. And this container is what we call a row. So this one here is a row for these 2 columns. Then here is a row for these 3 columns. This one is a row for these 2 columns, and so on and so forth. So all columns that are, let's say, in a line, they are in one row always, okay? So we have to build rows and columns. So let's now code up this grid system here, okay? This shouldn't be all too hard. There's actually a lot of advanced CSS involved here, but I'm sure you're gonna master that, right? For now, let's see if our page is actually still working. And you see something is strange here. So let's check what's wrong. And I suspect that it's actually once again here some problem. And yeah, that's right. So something here went wrong again. So let me close this and open a new tab and restart the process. So npm run compile CSS. I think that's the name of the, let's take a look, compile SASS, okay. Then we need to make some change. Okay. Now hit run, and okay, so everything looks normal, okay? Now before we actually start writing the CSS, let's start by writing the HTML markup to have something similar to this, okay? Now this is of course only for testing purposes. We don't want anything here like this on our web page, right? So starting then with the HTML, let's put it here after the header, okay? So let's just put a section here just to test our grid, okay? Class grid test, okay? Now in here we're gonna have a couple of rows, of course. So div class row, and then these columns. So the first type of columns, I'm gonna call it call 1 of 2. And that's the text I'm going to put in there so that we can nicely see what we're actually talking about. And then the second column. So these 2 here will basically become these 2 later when we have the CSS in place. And now let's make this part here. So as I was saying, these columns are always in a row, okay? And so these are going to be called 1 of 3, 1 of 3, and then of course we're going to have 3 as well. So I was missing this part here. So call 1 of 3. And now we also have this one here, right? So a column 2 of 3, which spans over these two here. So another row, of course. And again, this is just for testing purposes. We're not going to have this one here in our design. So 2, and then here 2. So you see the logic? This one is a 1 part of a 3-part grid. And this here is basically 2 parts of the 3-part grid. Okay, so this one here. And now finally the last one. Actually, let me copy this one because it's more similar already to what we have. Just copy this one. And then I use this trick where I select all the 3s by hitting Command D and 4. Okay, and now all we have to do is to make this line here and this line. So this is a 1 of 2 and this is a 3 of 4. Actually, this is 2 of 4, of course, sorry for the mistake. So column 2 of 4, and so 1 plus 1 plus 2 makes the 4, right? And then finally, the last one, where we have 3. So 1 plus 3 makes the total of 4. So this is our HTML markup so that we can test our classes. So we're now ready to go to work with our CSS. And as you can probably guess, we are going to make a whole new SASS file to build this grid, okay? And since this is actually a layout part, so part of the layout, we will put it in the layout folder. So we do a new partial here, SCSS, and then we import it here, of course, in the main file. All right, so starting with the row. First off, we need to define a width for the row. And one of the standards that is used these days is to make a 1140 pixels grid. Okay, so width 1140 pixels. Now, what's wrong with this? I'm sure that you guessed it. That's right, we want to use rams and not pixels. And so all we have to do is to divide this number by 10, because we already know that 10 pixels equals 1 rem, right? So 140 rem. But it's still not perfect, because what we actually want is not width, but max width. And what's the difference between width and max width? And let me actually show it to you in here. So the max width of this is 1140 pixels, right? Now decrease the screen like this, then you will see that everything starts to adapt to the width of the screen. So what max what max width means is that if we have enough available space, then it will have the width that we specified. But if there's not enough width, so basically if the viewport is smaller than the width that we specified here, so in this case, if the viewport is smaller than 114 rem, then it will simply fill 100% of the available space that it has. Okay? Let's actually give it some kind of background color just so that we can see what's going on. So background color, I'm going to give it a nice gray here. Okay. And the last thing we want to do is to always center this row in the viewport. So how do we do that? And probably you already know the trick, right? So what we do is margin, 0, and auto. And that's the trick that everyone uses to center block elements inside of another block element. So we say that the margin on top and of the bottom is 0, and left and right is auto. And why does that actually work? Well, when we say that we want the margin to be automatically, this means that the browser, when rendering the page, will automatically figure out the margin that we want on the left and on the right side, right? And since it's both set to auto, it means that left and right will be the same. And CSS will automatically calculate the left margin and the right margin, and they will be the same. And so, of course, the element will be centered. So that's the simple logic behind this. And let's now actually check out our page. And well, something is not working again. Let me check out what's going again, this error here, okay? So let me run it again. I should probably change the autosave function in my code editor. I'm gonna do that later. All right, and now here we go. So we have our column with this night width, and it's also centered in the browser. So perfect. Let's just inspect it so we can see. All right, so up there you see that's actually 1140 pixels wide. Now one last thing that we should also do about these rows is that we should have some space, some gutter between these rows. So imagine we have a layout and then we have multiple rows, and we naturally want some space between them, right? So let's take care of that. And so we say margin bottom of, let's say, 80 pixels. Now these values that we're specifying here, like this max width and this margins, they are great candidates for specifying a variable so that we have one place in the variable files where we can easily change all of these values by simply changing one variable. So let's actually do that by opening this file. And now starting to organize this a bit, let's put some comments here. So these are colors, okay? And now down here, we will have variables for our grid. So let's say grid width. So remember 114 RAM. And if one day in the future we want to change this, we don't have to search through all the files. We simply can change it here in the variables file, okay? And now I will also specify a variable called gutter vertical and set it to the 80 pixels, sorry, that we had before, which is equivalent to 8 RAM. And since we're at it, I can also specify the horizontal gutter, right? And I will set this to 60 pixels, so 6 RAM. And the horizontal gutter is, of course, it's these spaces here in between the columns. And this is even better to have as a variable, because once we start specifying these gutters and these columns, we will use this value over and over again. And so this is a perfect candidate for a SASS variable. Okay, so let's now just go ahead and actually use these. It's grid width. And then here, it's a gutter vertical. All right, so let's check it out. And yep, so here we go. Actually show you something, because you see this is the last row here, okay? So between all these rows we have a margin, and then also, of course, the last one. Now this doesn't make much sense, okay? So we want the last one not to have a margin in the bottom. So let's simply remove that, and I'm sure you know a good way of doing that. So what would that way be? It would be simply to use the last child pseudo class and then set the margin bottom to 0 on that one, right? But we can do even better. And what I mean is to use the not pseudo selector. So let me show you how it works. So we can use it on the row. And so you already know by now that we can then use the ampersand operator. And then we set the not pseudo class. So we have row not. So of course, let me just show it to you again, just to make sure we're on the same page here. So this is what we have here, right? So row not. And now what we can do here is to specify another pseudo class in here. So let me first show it to you and then explain it. So last child. Now let's duplicate here. Okay. All right. So what does this not here actually do? Now without the not, this would simply select the last child, right? So if we had this last child, then we would simply select the last child, so the last row element. Now what the not does here is that it simply does the opposite. So we select everything except the last child. So it's basically just the opposite. Instead of selecting the last child, we select everything except the last child, right? And so what we can do now is to simply put this margin bottom in here. And that's it. So now instead of setting the vertical gutter here, these 80 pixels, on all of these rows, we put it on all the rows except the last child. So this is what the not here does. Everything except the last child. Okay, does that make sense? So another very powerful pseudo class that you just learned here. And let's check it out. And indeed, it is now gone. So really cool. And you see it apply here. At least you should see it should be somewhere here. Well, it's actually not. Of course it's not. It is in these ones here. Okay. So here you have row, not, last child, margin bottom. So these ones, of course, have the margin bottom. And then only this last one does not have that declaration block. All right, cool. Now we're ready to work on the columns. Let's start with the very first column, which is the column 1 of 2. Okay. And since we always have these columns inside of rows, we can actually nest it here inside of the row selector, right? So call 1 of 2. And so this will translate to a column which is always inside of a row. Okay, and so now how do we actually define the width of this column? Let's take a look here at the example. So what is the width of this column here? It is very simply the entire width of this row, right? Minus this gutter, this space here, okay, divided by 2, right? So again, this entire space here, ranging from the left side all the way to the right side here, is 100%, okay? If we then subtract this gutter space here, we end up with the entire space that these two columns can occupy. And if we then divide that in 2 parts, we end up with the width of one of the columns. Okay, and that's exactly what we want. So let's do that in CSS. Now, how do we actually do these calculations? Well, in CSS, there is an extremely powerful function which is called calc. And in here, you can do mathematical operations and you can actually mix units in here. And that's really important. It's a huge advantage. So again, this allows us to make calculations where we can mix units. And that's a big difference between doing native CSS calculations or doing them in SASS. Because in SASS, we can also do operations, of course, but we cannot do them with multiple units. So we cannot, for example, mix RAM with pixels with percentages. And it's actually pretty logical why it is that way. And it is so because we compile our SASS file while we're developing the page. So even before the page is served, of course, to the user. But this kind of calculation all depends on the layout. So it has to happen while the website is rendered using the visual formatting model. So that's when these calculations can occur. Because it's only then when CSS and when the browser knows what a percentage is, what a RAM is, and what all of that stuff is. Okay? So we have to do it using the native calc functions. And so let's now translate what we were saying earlier. So we have 100% of the width, okay? And from that, we subtract the gutter. So the gutter that we have is called gutter horizontal, remember? And then we simply have to divide all of this into parts. So if you know any math, we have to put these parentheses here so that it first does this calculations. So So 100 minus the gutter. Okay, so we put it into parentheses so that this operation happens first, and then the result of that will be divided by 2. Okay, but that's actually not enough to make this working, because in the calc function in CSS, if we want to use a SASS variable, we have to actually do this little thing. So we have to use the hash and then wrap it into these curly braces. Okay, and with this, it will actually work. Okay, so let's now give this a background color so we can see it. Let's use orange red here just for exemplification. Then of course we also want to actually see the gutter, right? So we want a margin on the right side of the column, which will then be the gutter. Now remember that there's only one gutter here, right? So in the case of the 1, 2 column, it's only in the first one. So this gutter here will be the right margin of this first column here. And then when we do these columns here, then this gutter will be the right margin of this column, and this gutter will be the right margin of this column. And so we always want the right margin to be on all of the columns except the last one. And that's exactly what we did with the row before, right? So let's now do that. And so once again, we can use the not pseudo class. And then in here, we can use the last child. So margin right and gutter horizontal. All right, and so our columns also have a gutter now, so a margin right. Now only one thing left, which since we're using a float layout here, of course we need to float these columns. Okay, so we use float left. So we always float all these columns to the left side. And so now like this, we are ready to actually take a look at our result. And yeah, so wow, it's actually working already. So our first column, our gutter, and our second column. Let's actually inspect this one. So here you have the margin right of 6 rem, which is the horizontal gutter that we defined. And here you saw the selector that we built. So the column 1 of 2, which is inside of a row element, and then not the last child, right? Okay, now just one thing that I want to show you is that this row here has a 0 pixel height. And I'm sure you know why that happens. And it is because all of the child elements of this row element are floated, and so the height collapses and becomes 0. And what do we do against that? That's right, we use the clear fix hack. And we already did that once actually in our initial SASS lectures, and so let's do that again. And remember that by then we used a SASS mixin, right? So a reusable piece of code that we could then add here to this row declaration block. So let me show you again how it works. So let's write our first mixin here in the mixins file. So a mixin always starts with us writing mixin, then the name of the mixin, which is clearfix in this case, clearfix, and then what do we want this clearfix to actually do? So how does the clearfix actually work? So what the clearfix does is to append a pseudo element after the element, which will then clear these floats. And so what we can do is to use the ampersand operator and then after. All right. So once we're going to include this mixin here in our grid, right, it will then simply copy this code here. And so this ampersand that we're writing in the mixin then will transform to row. So it will then be something like this, just to show it to you. After, and then all the code that we're going to write. So let's do that. So how does the clearfix work? Again, we always need to specify the content property, otherwise a pseudo element will simply not appear on the page. And we want it empty because we don't want to see this element on the page. Then we also need to display it. And the way it's done is to use the table value in here. So that's simply the standard version of the clearfix, so display table. And then finally the property that actually performs this clearfix is the clear property. And so this will clear both floats, so float left and float right, so that it's going to work no matter if we use float left or float right. And that's actually it. All right, so let's now include the mixin in here. And let me actually put it here before this columns. So include clearfix. And that should do the trick. Let's check it out. And yeah, I think it looks different. And so yeah, here we go. So our row now has again a complete height with 17 pixels in this case. So we cleared the float. We already have the 1 of 2 columns nicely set up. So let's now move on to the next type of columns. And so all we have to do in order to finish this lecture is now code up all of these different columns, which shouldn't be all too hard. Okay, so let's now do that. So let's start with call 1 of 3. And so how is the width going to work this time? Let us take a look actually, okay? So this is actually pretty similar to what we had before. So we have 100%, and if we subtract this gutter and then divide the result by 3, because now we have 3 columns, then we end up with the width of one of the columns, right? So it's very similar to the one that we had before, and so let's do that. So 100% minus, and now 2 times the gutter horizontal. And here this part is missing. And now divide this result by 3, because this time we have, of course, 3 columns. All right. And now this stuff here is actually the same. Now, of course, I should not simply copy this code here into this column, right? Really against don't repeat yourself practice, okay? And we're also not going to do one of the solutions that I mentioned earlier, something like a mix-in or something like that. That also doesn't make much sense here. Instead, what we want to do is to basically select all of the columns at the same time and then apply these styles to all these columns. So let me show you, I think, the best way to do that. And for that, we're going to use the attribute selector. Okay, so let's do that here. Now we could, of course, go ahead and add a new class to all of these columns. So we could add something like simply call and then select that and then have a specific style only for call 1 of 4. But that again would be a bit too much, I think. So I prefer to use the selector that I'm going to show you, which is the attribute selector. And so we start with the brackets, okay, so like this. And then in here, we can specify an attribute. And so for example, we could put source if we wanted, just an example. So source is an attribute of the image. For example, let's see. So this here, for example, this image has the source of image logo white. And so we could now select all of the elements that have this exact source. Or we could also select by alt. So we could say something like alt logo. And actually, let's do that. So we could do something like this. And this would basically select all of the elements which have this alt attribute equal to logo. Now in this case, that's not what we want at all, obviously. What we want is to select based on class. Now, why do we select based on class if we could simply do it with a dot, right? But let me show you, because what we can do also here is to not just select equal, but we can do something like this. For example, this symbol here means that we want the beginning to be what we set here. So let's set this one to call dash, and that is it. So what does this do? It will select all of the elements in which the class attribute starts, and that's what this symbol here means. So where all the class attributes start with call. And that is exactly our case, right? So we have all the columns starting with call dash. So call dash 1 and 1, and you see all of these are selected. And so this is a nice way to select all of the columns at the same time. So again, the magic happens actually here with this symbol. So this allows us to select only the ones that start with call dash. Now we can use other symbols here, so other selectors here as well. So instead of this, we could have the asterisk. And what this would mean is that select any classes which contain this part call. Okay, but that's not what we want, because this could lead to some mistakes maybe. And so we only really want the ones that start with call. Actually, there's another one. So you could put this sign here, so like the dollar sign, and then it would mean any class that ends with call dash. So we can do start with call, end with call, or simply contain call. Okay, but what we want here is this. Now there are a lot of applications for this selector here. For example, we could also select links based on a specific href attribute, or we could also select anchor elements which have their target attribute set to blank. So these are the links that open in a new tab when we click them, and we could then style these ones differently than the regular links. And so there's a whole lot of applications for this kind of selector. So keep this one in mind when you start building your own pages. Now what we really wanted to do here is to actually pass all of this in here, right? So now all of the classes that we have will have this float property set to left, so they will be floated to the left, and also they will have their right margin set to this gutter that we specified, but only all except the last one, which is what this not does here. All right, and if we now check out, all right, so here we go. Our one of 3 columns are now also working. And you see that already it styled these remaining columns with the color that we specified, and also with the gutter, right? So all we have to really do next is to specify their width, okay? Now just to show you, let me show you, for example, so here is that selector that we just wrote before. So it selects first the row and then in there all the elements with the class starting with call dash. And so you saw that this really worked. Okay, let's continue with the 104. And then in the end, we will do the intermediate ones, 203 and the other ones as well. So how is this one going to work? Well, again, very similar to the other ones. So this time we have 3 gutters, of course, and then we simply divide it by 4 because we have 4 columns. Very simple, right? And so you see that it's already working in here. Now all we have to do is to specify this, this, and this remaining columns. So let's actually copy this. 2 of 3. And now it actually gets a bit more complicated. So what is the width of this kind of column? So let's check it out here in our example. Okay. So what is the width of this column? Can you see it? And actually it's easy to see it up here. So the width of this column is the width of the normal column, so of the 103 column, plus another of these columns, so 2 times this column plus the gutter. And that's actually it. So all we have to do is now translate this to code. So again, the width of this column is this one plus the gutter. So let's do that. And so what we have here already is actually the width of one of the columns, right? So let's simply wrap that in parentheses. All right. And multiply it by 2. So 2 times the width of the simple column plus the gutter width. And that should be it. So again, we simply multiply 2 times the width of the single 103 column, so this one here, we multiply it by 2 and then add the gutter width, which is exactly what we discussed a bit earlier. So let's take a look. And well, something is not really working here. Let's take a look. What's happening? Well, something is not right. I see. Okay, of course I misspelled this word here. It's not width, it's of course horizontal. Okay, sorry about that one. And now of course it's working. So this column plus this gutter makes this column here. And so let's do now the same thing for the call 204, which actually is the same. So 104 plus 104 plus this gutter will make this 204 column. All right, so let's do that. So call 204, and so let's have 2 times, open parentheses, and then close them here. So always be careful with the parentheses, and then we simply add the gutter again. And let's just copy it so that I don't make the same mistake again. And so yeah, let's check it out. And here we go. So everything's working. And so now there's only one left, which is a 304. The logic now is actually pretty similar. So the 304 is the same as having this column plus this one plus this one plus this gutter and this gutter. Okay, so 3 times the 104 column plus 2 times the gutter. So let's just copy all of this. 3. Then here, remember we multiplied by 3 now, and then 2 times the gutter. And that's it. And indeed, it is now working just fine. And so with this, we actually already have our grid system in place, meaning that we are now ready to use it in the rest of the project. Now I know that this math here that we did can seem a bit scary, but once you understand it, it's really no problem. And since you now know how to do it, you can simply copy it for next time, so for your next project, and then use it. So it's way better to use your own stuff, at least that's my opinion, and know exactly how it works and what you're doing, instead of always relying on some third-party external stuff. At least that is my opinion. Now, if we think that this gutter is maybe too large or too small, then again, if you have another project with some other requirements, you can very simply come here and change it. So for example, imagine we want a bigger gutter. So all we have to do is to increase it, and now you see the gutter is really huge. Or if it's too big, then you can just put it to something really small, like 2. You can come here and you have smaller gutters. So that is the power of CSS variables. Changing one value in one place, and then it takes effects on the entire page, everywhere where you used this variable, okay? So our grid system is now in place. Let's just hide this CSS here from our page, because we don't really want to see this, right? So HTML comments, they work like this. And now at the end, we just close them like this. And that's it. So now we commented out our code. And so each time that we want to now use one of these columns or one of these rows with the columns inside, we can come here and copy them and just use our grid as we intended. All right. So this was essential in order to move on, and also for you on the way to becoming a more advanced CSS developer. So now you really know how grids are configured and how they work, and how you could easily build your own. With our grid now in place, we can actually start using it now by building the About section, so the section that comes after the header. But there's a lot more to do in this section. And so in this lecture, or to be more precise, while we build this section, which is actually going to take more than just one lecture, you are going to learn how to think about components and where to place our code in the overall CSS architecture. You'll also learn about utility classes, how to use the background clip property, especially with text, how to transform multiple properties at the same time, how to use the outline offset property together with outline, and finally, how to style elements that are not hovered while other elements are. And this will give us a really cool effect, as you will see. So this is the section that we're going to build next. So we started with the header here, and then now we're going to build this section here. Now before writing a single line of code, let's remember our think, build, architect mindset that we talked about before, right? So let's think and break it down what we have to build in this section. So first up we have this heading here, and so this is an element of the typography. And this here as well. So this is another heading, and this is simply a paragraph. And so these should probably go into our typography file, right? Then we also have the small button here, okay? So think of this as a secondary button. So up here we have the main button, okay? And then here we have this, like the smaller secondary button. So that's the left side. And actually this is already using the grid. So we have 2 columns here, one on the left and one on the right, okay? And so here on this side we have this image composition here. So these 3 images, where the one that we hover comes to the top and the other ones become smaller, you see? So we hover, this one becomes bigger and the other one become smaller, and we also have this green border around the image. So that's all, so that I can show you a couple more CSS properties which you can then use on your own sites in the future. So this part here, this image composition, I'm going to treat it as a component actually. So a reusable piece of code, or let's say a module, that we can use in other parts of our site. Like imagine that this Nature company is going to grow and they will have a bigger website with lots of pages, and then maybe we're going to want to use this image composition here somewhere else, so on the other pages. And so we should build this as a single component, which will stay independent and also in its own file. Okay, so that's what we're going to build here. Also, we need to set some styles for this section, this overall section, like this container where all of this is going to be inside, right? So you see it has this slightly gray background here. So this outside here we have the white background, and then here this is slightly gray, okay? And so we also have to have some styles for that. All right, so let's start with the HTML, such as we did before. So in here we have the header first. And so let's now create a main element. So this is another HTML5 element, and this is just to tell search engines or screen readers that this is really the main part of our site. So we have the header, we have then the main part, which will contain the rest of the website, and then finally at the end we're also going to have a footer, okay? So this is like just a huge container which will contain most of our website, because that's the main part. Now before we continue writing HTML, there's actually something that I want to show you, and that's called emmet. Okay, so emmet. And this is basically an extension that you can install on your text editor, like in Brackets, in Atom, and in Sublime, and of course also in Visual Studio Code. It's like an extension which allows us to write HTML a lot faster. And so from this part on, I'm going to start using that, because this is actually a CSS course and I don't want to spend so much time writing all this HTML and make you lose your time by watching me typing all this HTML. And so I'm going to use this Emmet extension, and I highly encourage you to try it as well, and so do it alongside with me, because this will make your life a lot easier when writing HTML. And it's very simple. There's just 2 or 3 rules that you need to know, and then you're good to go, and it will make your coding a lot faster in HTML. So imagine that you want to write a div with the class test. All you have to do is write .test and then hit tab. And that's it. So it wrote a div with a class of test, and it already closed that div element for you as well. And so now you can start writing the HTML in here. So great, right? So for a div, you can just start with a dot and then the class. Now if you want another element, like a section like we want now, you actually have to write the name of that HTML element first. So section, and now the class dot, and I'm going to call this section the section about. And now I hit tab, remember, and that's it. So now we have a section called section about. Got that? So again, I highly encourage you to go download that package for your text editor so that you can follow along with me as I type the code this way. All right, so let's now start with the h2 element actually that we talked about before. So h2 dot, I'm going to call it heading secondary. Remember, we already have a heading primary for the h1, and so this one is the heading secondary. So I'm using Emmet here again. Now I hit tab, and that's it. So the text here is exciting tours for adventurous people. Okay, so let's start by styling actually this section. And where should we put this in our CSS architecture? What do you think? Well, I'm going to put it in the home SASS file. And that's because this is a style very specific to the home page, so this landing page that we're coding currently. So nowhere else on this entire website, even if it grows to many more pages, nowhere else there will be a section about, at least not one similar to this. And so this is a specific style of our home page. And this is why I'm putting it right here. So section about. And let's start with the background color here, okay? So background color, and now we have a color here. So once again, let's declare a variable for that, okay? So we have a very light gray, and so I'm going to call it color gray light, and actually I'm going to call it 1 because I already know that there will be multiple gray colors, okay? So F7, F7, F7. This is a very nice and subtle gray color, very similar to white, but it gives us a little bit, a very subtle contrast to the white color. And so let's copy that name actually and put it here. Great. Now some padding. So let's put 25 rem, let's say, on the top and also on the bottom, okay? So I'm using 25 rem here because, let me show you why. So this is our page, and here we go. So you see that our section is starting right here, which actually makes sense. So right after this header, right? So we have this header, and then from here is where our section starts. But this gives us this problem that we have this white wedge here, so this triangle, and we want to get rid of that. And so we need to somehow move up this entire part, right? Now, how much is this here actually? And there's actually a way to find out. So let's take a look, and it is in the header file. So you see that the height of the header is 95 VH, so 95% of the height of the viewport. And then we know that this polygon on the right side goes until 75 VH, right? So from here to here, it's 75. And from here to here, so like to here, it's 95. And so the difference has to be 20. So 20 VH is this difference, 95 minus 75. Make sense? So let's then do that. And to move up this entire thing, we can actually specify the top margin. So margin top, and then we give it a negative margin. And so instead of moving down, it moves up. VH, and let's take a look. And so here we go. So now it moved here up until this point. Now we have a lot of space down here, but we can always change and fix that later, okay? So for now, let's just worry about this H2 here, right? So as we were saying, this H2 is part of our typography. So let's go to that file and write our heading secondary block in there. So let's start with some basic styles like the font size. Font size 3.5 rem, so 35 pixels. Text transform of uppercase. And then let's say we want our font weight of 700. So it's quite a bold text like this, okay? So let's take a look now. And here we go. Now what's special about the H2 that we're going to do, let's take a look. Like crazy style here when we hover it, this is just to show you some more CSS stuff, okay? But what's really cool here is actually this gradient. So this gradient color that we have going on here right inside the text. So you see this side here is this light green and it moves all the way to our darkest green. So this is a really nice effect, I think. It looks really modern. And so let me show you how to do it. So the trick is to first set the background of the entire H2, so of this entire element, to a gradient. So the background image will be a linear gradient, and we have done that before. So we want it to go to the right, so basically from the left to right, and the colors are, remember, or color primary light and color primary dark. Right? Remember we defined them here before. So color primary light and dark. Let me actually close this one here, the mixins as well, and the package, and also the grid. So not so many files open here now. That's better. So let's take a look. And all right. Now what we want next is this gradient only to go all until this here. So we want it to stop where the text stops, basically. So how can we do that this element does not occupy 100% of its available width? So right now it's a block element, and that's why it does that. But if we change it, it will no longer do it. And what do we have to change it to? That's right. So display inline block. And if you take a look now, that's much better. Okay, and now the next step in making that effect happen with the gradient behind the text. So what we're going to do is to use the brand new WebKit background clip property. And it's so new that we actually have to use this WebKit prefix. So WebKit background clip. All right. So we set this property to text. And so what happens now is that the background gets clipped exactly where the text is. So again, we set this background clip property to text, and what this is going to do is that it will clip the background, and in this case, that's this linear gradient, it will clip it to exactly the places where the text sits. And so therefore, this background image, so this gradient, will only be visible where the text is. Now, what we want to see then is to not actually the text, but the background image. So imagine that right now we have the background image only where the text is, and then on top of that, we have the text. So let's make this text transparent so that we can see the background image, so the linear gradient. So what we can do is very simply set the color to transparent. And that's it. Let's check it out now. And here we go. So that's our effect. Let me just inspect this one and show you what happens if we do not do this transparent, right? Then what happens is that you see the text, which sits on top of the clipped background. And so we want to make this text invisible, so transparent. And so now you can see this really nice gradient. So let's now take care of this, like this crazy effect that we have going on here, right? So this one. So let's go back here. And so now this happens on hover. So by now you already know how to do it. with the SASS nesting. So this will translate to heading secondary and then hover. So these effects that you saw, these are basically transform. And on transform, we can actually put multiple things at the same time that we want to transform. So you already saw translate X and Y. You already saw scale. You also saw rotate already. So now let's use skew. So we can skew in the X direction as well as in the Y direction. So let's start with the Y direction. So skew, Y. And then here we specify it in degrees. So let's just say 2 degrees. Let's take a look at what happens. Now before that, let's also add a transition property here, right? Transition property, and set it to all 0.2 seconds. Okay. Also, to make it a bit nicer, I will also add some more ladder spacing here. So ladder spacing 2 pixels. Now I'm using pixels here and not rem. So why is that? Well, 2 pixels is such a small thing that it doesn't really matter if it's gonna scale or not. It's actually the exact same thing if I do 0.2 rem, because no matter if we increase the root font size or not, this will probably always translate to just 2 pixels because of rounding issues. But okay, let's keep it like that. Okay. All right, and so that is skewing in the Y direction. Let's actually change this to like 20 degrees so that we can see a more dramatic effect, right? So something like this. So it's not only rotating, it's really skewing all of these letters. Now we can also do it in the X direction, and sometimes this makes for really cool effects. We'll actually see another application of this a bit later. I'll just put 15 degrees in here now. So let's take a look again. And now it does these 2 at the same time. Let me just show you what would happen if it was only on the Y direction. No, actually on the X direction, sorry. So on the X direction only, it looks like this. Okay. So let's put it back here, 2 degrees. And now we can also at the same time scale it a little bit. So 1.1 for example. So it becomes 110%. Also some text shadow beneath it. And this time we can do it in 2 directions. So in the X direction, let's go 5 pixels, so 0.5 rem. Then in the Y direction, 1 rem, so 10 pixels, and 20 pixels of blur, so 2 rem. And now the color RGBA, and color black, and now let's give it like 20% opacity, so 0.2. All right, so let's take a look now. And all right, so that looks pretty much like the one we have in our original. Now, one last thing is that we should actually center this entire thing here, right? And the way that I prefer to do this is to wrap this element into a parent element and then center the text from there. So let me show that to you and actually introduce you to a new concept called utility classes, okay? So let's actually put a div around this here. And the class that we're going to put here will be called uCenterText, okay? So what this class does is that it will very simply center the text which is inside of it. Let me adjust this here a bit now. So as I was saying, this is a utility class. And utility classes are very simple classes in CSS which only have one simple goal. And in this case, it will simply be to center text. Okay? And why did I do it? Why didn't I simply call it like heading secondary parent or something like that? Well, I didn't do that because I want to reuse this piece of CSS here. So this class, which will have the CSS attached. And also it wouldn't make much sense to make a whole class just for centering this piece of text, right? And so utility classes are a great tool that we should use and have in our toolbox. So actually we already created this file here for the utilities, and so let's put it now here. So uCenterText. I think that was the name, right? I remember uCenterText, yeah, right. And so actually we just need one line here. So text align, center, and that's it. And so now the text that we have here will become centered. And that's because this is a inline block element now. Remember, this heading secondary, we define it as an inline block. And so if we set the parent to text align center, then that inline block element inside it is treated as text and will therefore be centered in the parent. So let's take a look at that. And indeed, here it is. All right, so we're making great progress. Let's now move on. And let's start by actually using our grid for the first time. So we have these two columns here. So let's just implement them here. So as I was saying, we can now come here simply and copy this markup we already have here from our grid test. Now we just have to fix this formattation here. But that's not a big problem. There are actually some extensions that you can download for your text editor, which will take this pain of formatting it from you. All right, so let's just put some text here. Like text content will go in here, and then in here we will have our image composition. Let's just take a look at here. And indeed, here we are. Okay, so when we did this, we actually forgot to remove these colors here. So let's quickly do that and open up our grid file again. And let's quickly get rid of this background color and of this one. So save and close. Now another thing that I noticed here was this lack of space that we have here. So we should have some space between the H2 element and of course the content that comes after it. Now we could quickly go ahead and simply add some margin to our heading secondary element, right? And there would be no problem in doing so. But the thing is that we can already start thinking ahead. And so let's take a look at what we have here. So there's another H2 here. There's another one. And there's another one. And let me show you where another one is. And it's here, okay? And what you're starting to notice now is that the spacing that's behind them is not always the same. And that actually makes a lot of sense. Because remember, we wanted this element or this block to be independent and reusable across the page. But if we now go ahead and add a margin to the bottom of, let's say, 80 pixels or something, then that would influence the way that we could use the secondary heading across our page. So for example here, we don't want any of that margin. And I think also in here, it's a different margin here as well. And so what we should do in this specific place is to use another utility class. Okay, so we're going to use another utility class here. And this one will be called uMarginBottom80. Or 8 actually, for 8 rem. So here we have another utility class which allows us to very easily set some margins across our page in a very simple way, which at the same time allow our main components or blocks or elements to stay independent and reusable across the page. So that's the reason why we used this utility class here, and that's the reason why we're going to use this utility class as well. And so what I want you to do is to always think like this, okay? That's why I'm insisting so much all the time in these reusable, independent, and all of that stuff, okay? It's because I want you to get used to this notion, to this way of thinking about our interfaces. Okay, with that in mind, let's define actually this class. So margin bottom 80 or 8 rem. And so of course later when we come to that pop-up that I just showed you, we will then have to define another utility class for that specific margin that we want by then. Does that make sense? So let's just check it out finally. And yeah, so now we have some nice spacing going on here, okay? All right, and that should be enough for one lecture. Let's leave the other stuff that we want to do. So putting the text content here and the image composition on this side, let's leave that for the next lecture so that you can take a break. So welcome back after taking your break. Let's now continue building the About section. And so this was where we took off after the last lecture. So what we have here, again, is these two headings. And I'm going to call them tertiary headings, so the third level of a heading, which means H3 in practice. And then this here is just going to be some paragraph, okay? So this is some very simple styles, so let's now very quickly implement them. But once again, before we start with our markup here. So we're inside of this column here, so we can actually right now start writing our H3 here. So again, I'm going to use Emmet, and I hope that you're already using it as well. So H3, and now heading tertiary. And the text goes like, you're going to fall in love with nature. And then after that, we have a paragraph element, which I'm simply going to call paragraph. So hit tab and then some text here. Okay. Now, if you're using Emmet already, then you can simply write lorem to get some blind text. So some text that is just like a filler text. So you write lorem and then you hit tab, and then this weird looking text here appears, like in Latin or something. You could also go to a generator like this one, lorem ipsum generator, and then get some text from down here. You can even generate more paragraphs or sentences or words or whatever. So if you need some blind text, you can use a tool like that, or just use Emmet. Now, it's actually not the best practice to use blind text when we build web pages. It's always best to work with the final content that's going to be on the site. But in case we don't have that, then it's okay to just use blind text, okay? And so now I'm copying this because we have two headers. And the second one says, live adventures like you never have before. So let me try it. And now it's no longer working. Well, why is that? It's probably because it's already written in here. Let me delete it just to... Yeah, it's true. And so actually you see that the text that it wrote here now is a bit different than what we have here, right? So it looks better on the final web page if the text isn't exactly the same. And so, as we were discussing in the last lecture, these are very simple styles concerning the typography of our website. So we're not really calling them components or anything, they are just typography styles. And so heading, tertiary, as well as paragraph are going here to our typography file. All right, and also the paragraph. Now this is not going to be anything really fancy here. All we want to do is to set some font size, like 1.6 rem, and maybe a font weight here as well. So let's say 700, so to make it a bit bolder. And then, such as our other headings, let's also transform it to uppercase. So text transform uppercase. All right, and as for the paragraph, let me set the font size to 1.6 as well. 1.6 rem. And now what I also want, I want the paragraphs to have a margin at the bottom. And that's because we usually use a bunch of different paragraphs, one after the other. And so it makes sense to have a bit of space between them. But we don't want any space between the last one. And do you remember how we did that? And that's right, we used the not pseudo class again. So just like this. Not, and then last child. And so we're selecting everything except the last child. So the opposite of last child. Last child is what, it's just the last one, but not last child is everything except the last child. And so let's give it some margin at the bottom of 30 pixels. So 3 rem. So let's check this out now. All right. This looks actually pretty good already. Let's just take a look. And actually, so yeah, this has the margin at the bottom, but this one does not because it's the last child. And so therefore, our rule that we applied before does work indeed. Now, one last thing we can do here with this text is to set some margin in here. Now, I want you to keep in mind what we did with this heading here. So we used the helper class to set this margin that you see here. Remember this 80 pixels, this 8 rem here, right? And that's because of reusability. We want to reuse this throughout the page. And the same thing might be true for this H3 element here, of course. And so let's now do the exact same thing. So we want to reuse it, and so we're simply going to add a utility class, because we might want some of these headings with space, but others without space. And so a utility class is the way to go here. Sorry, I didn't intend to just delete that. And we want to add it here as well as here, right? And so I can use the trick that I showed you earlier with multiple cursors. So here and now I hit Command or Control, probably on Windows. And now I have two cursors, and I can write the same thing in two places. So U margin bottom 2. So I'm going with 20 pixels here. And you know what would be actually better here? Instead of having these numbers, it would be having some designations, so some names. Because right now we're actually hard coding the margin in here. So this would basically be the same as having an inline style and set the margin directly in here, right? So what's really the point of having it like this here with this name already saying that it's 2, if we could just set the inline style to 2 rem, right? So let me just delete this here and call it small, and in here call it big. Okay, so this one is big, and now we want one that is small, and maybe even one that is called medium or something. So small and one called medium, let's say. So let's make it 2 and this one 4. Maybe we can use it later at some point. And now it makes sense to have the utility classes like that, because then if we later want to change this margin bottom actually to like 4 or 1.5 or something like that, then the name still makes sense that we have here in our markup. Okay, so let's check it out. And yeah, okay. And actually I think it's a bit too much, so let's change it to 1.5. And so now imagine we would have to go back and then change it here to what? To 1.5 or 1-5. That would be weird, okay? So it's better like this. So let's hope it updates. Did not update. Well, why is that? Inspect. And yeah, actually it did. Okay, so 1.5 rem now. And actually, since we're looking here at the rem, there's something I want to show you. So remember all the talk that we had about the way that units are processed in CSS, right? And we talked about declared values and cascaded values and used values and computed values and all of that stuff, right? And actually what this DevTools here allows you to do is to see the computed values. And so in here we have, for example, 1.5 rem, and then we have all the computed values. For example, we see the 16 pixels that we have. We see that all of these are set to 0. Remember that I was telling you that all of these elements, they have to have some value, right? So the padding has a value, all of 0, the margin has values, all of 0, except this one, which is 15. And then all of these properties here, they have values. And if we hit show all here, then we can actually see all of the CSS properties and all with all of their values. So if you remember that lecture, these values, they are either the inherited values or the default values, right? Okay, so we saw that we have here this 15 pixels, which came exactly from this 1.5 rem. So everything is working just as expected. Okay, so let's now take care of this button that we have here, okay? And I'm also now seeing that this text here is a bit smaller, and actually it looks a bit nicer that way here, right? So let's cut a bit of the other text, and then of course focus on this button here. So you see that when we hover the button, from the green underline, it becomes a green background, and you see the subtle shadow here, and then when we hit it, it goes down. So this is basically the same mechanism as here. When we hit it, it goes up a little bit, and then we click it, it looks like it moves away from the user. So basically, as if we were really physically clicking the button, okay? Like hitting the button with our hand. And that's the same impression that I wanted to create here. Okay. So as we were saying, let's take away some of this text. Well, maybe not this much. Let's just finish somewhere here. Okay. Yeah, looks better. Maybe one more word or two, and okay. So this button will be an anchor. So I just write a dot button text. Hit tab and that's it. Oh, and actually it also asks me here to complete the href. Okay. So I just pointed to nowhere. So that's why I'm using this hash symbol here. And if I now hit tab, you see that it will then come to this point here next, because there's already this gray cursor here. So I hit tab again, and now I'm here, and then, okay, and then I'm here. And so you see this Emmet extension, it's really, really helpful. For example, if I just write img, then it will automatically put these attributes here for me and let me cycle through them. So now I write something here, let's say A, B, C, and if I now hit tab, it will go to the next place where I can write some text. So text, and if I hit tab again, it goes to the end. Okay, so the text in here should be learn more. And then we have this arrow going on, and that is a HTML special character or a special symbol. And in HTML, we write them like that. So the ampersand and then a special code. So in this case, RARR. And that will translate into this arrow. Let's take a look. And yeah, so this is the arrow that I was telling you about. Now for a complete list of these, they're actually on my resources page. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. So let me just open it to you here. codingheroes.io/resources. All right, and then so here is this HTML entity reference by CSS Tricks. And so in here you have all these codes for these special symbols if you want to use them. But what I want to show you is this arrow, and I think it's somewhere down there. Let me see. Well, you have all these Greek letters going on here, some more Greek letters, and well, it should be somewhere here. Ah, okay, so here are the errors. And I really like to use these instead of using other icons, like coming from an icon font. So it's just easier to use this HTML code, okay? So if you don't know about this resource page, I have a bunch of resources here and I update it sometimes, and you can subscribe if you want to receive these updates, but of course you don't have to, okay? So let's close this again. And now we are ready to style this link. So we already have a file for a button component. So I say that we can simply add this smaller button here to this button component file as well, okay? So button text, and then we can put our styles here. So we will have some styles for the links and visited, and of course hover and active pseudo classes. So link, and by now you're already really familiar with the way we write this. So link and visited. And then we have one for the hover state. And then we have one for the active state. And this is actually pretty similar to the button that we wrote before. So let's just very quickly do this. Okay, so the color should be our primary green color, okay? So that it stands out nicely from the rest of the text. So our green color, we are going to display it as an inline block as always, so that we can use the box model properties on it, like padding, margin, and all that good stuff. So inline block. Then we want to get rid of the underlining. So text decoration, none, because we want to put our own decoration. So our own underlining. And we do that by having a border button. And it will be 1 pixel, solid, and again, the primary color. So the exact same color as the text. And we do that because this way we can set a padding between the text and the line, which otherwise we could not. So padding 3 pixels. And again, 3 pixels like this and 1 pixel is so small that it's not really going to change sizes if the user decides to change the base font size. And so if everything on the page scales up, 1 pixel will still be 1 pixel. Because in order to become 2 pixels, the user would have to change the base font size from 16 to 32, so to double it. And that's a bit extreme, so I mean, no one is going to do that. The same applies here to this padding. So if it's a really small unit, we can just leave it like that. All right, and now about the hover, remember how it looked like? I can actually show it to you again. Well, sometimes it doesn't really reload. I'm not sure why. And actually nothing's happening. Let me take a look why. So button text is the class of this. And button text is what I have here. So why is this not working? Oh, I see. I have an error here. So a small typo. Let's save it and take a look again. Oh yeah, so here we have it. Oh, also we forgot to style the size of this. So let's do that as well. And then remember that the hover effect is like this moves up a bit, has this shadow, and when we click, it moves down. So first things first, the font size should be like the text 1.6. And then let's take care of the hover effect. Now actually this 1.6 rem font size number here is coming up an awful lot of times. And so I think it's actually best to replace this with a variable. So if one day we want to change this 16 pixel like default font size that we have here on the page, we can simply do that by changing one variable. So let's do that. And let's say font sizes, or just font. And so default font size. And I'm simply calling it default font size because that's the font size we're like using all over the place. We use it in the paragraphs, in this button text, in the H3. We used it, I think, in the primary button as well. And so let's do a variable with that. Now, please don't confuse that with, where do we have it? Well, it's not here. I know. So please don't confuse it with this 62.5%. Okay, so we already talked about this. This is just a definition to define what 1 rem is, right? So all we're doing here in this variables file now is to say basically that we're using 1.6 rem all the time, and so we're using a variable for that. So I know that we use it here in the heading tertiary exactly, and down there as well. So default font size here and here. So let's save it here in the typography. And the utilities, I can close it. The main, I can also close it for now. And so here in the button, we also used it. And if I remember it right, we did it here as well. So yeah, font size here in the primary button is 1.6 as well. So everything is 1.6 now. So that is our version. Imagine that we have a client, for example, for which we are building the site. So you have all your site nicely set up and you're going to the client to show it to him. And he says, well, this text is way too small. I want it bigger. So what are you going to do? What do you prefer to do? Do you prefer to go to all of this code here and change font size manually to 1.8, for example, 1.8, all over the place? In the button, and the other typography styles that we saw? Or do you prefer to simply come here and change one number to 1.8 and everything changes? And you see, everything changes and the client is happy and everything is easier for you. So you just saved a lot of time and the client is happy and so everyone is happy. So you see variables, we should use them whenever we can, okay? And you can probably argue that I could use even more variables all over the place here, but I also don't want to make it too much here, okay? I want to keep it at a reasonable level. All right, anyway, let's not change this hover style. So background color, you saw it was this green as well. So default, actually color, primary. The text changed to white, so color white. And we have some box shadow going on, remember. It's 0 in the X direction, 10 pixels or 1 rem in the Y direction. Let's put 2 rem for the blur, and then the color RGBA, color black, and you're already used to writing this. I'm going with 15% here. So please feel free to play around with all these numbers to get a better feeling for them and to see what looks best. I just don't want to lose a lot of time by doing that now in here, because otherwise we end up with a course with 50 hours and that's way too much. But again, please play around with these values. Okay, and finally, I'm translating the button in the Y direction for 2 pixels, so minus 2 pixels actually. So we're going to move it up as we discussed earlier. Okay, so and since we want this to be animated, all of it, let's add the transition property here. Transition all 0.2 seconds. All right, and finally for the active, we want the box shadow. Let's actually copy this. So the box shadow of 0.5 rem, and then here just 1. And to translate it, we can actually move it back to its initial position, so 0. So let's take a look. Can close this. Well, something's not working here, at least not with the hover. Let me see where that's happening. Ah, all right. Maybe you spotted it already, but somehow I did not. And so, yeah, now it's working just fine. You see? Check. Okay, and now with this part gone, with everything working as expected, you should probably take another break so that this video doesn't become a 1 hour long video or something. So see you in a second, where we will finally finish with this image composition here. This is part 3, and hopefully the last part, of building the About section. So this is what we want to build. So we have these 3 images here, and when we hover one, it comes to the top and it will have this gray-like border around it, okay? And also, when we hover one, the other ones become smaller. So you see, this one grows and the other ones become smaller, right? You see that? Okay, so let's now do that. And we start with the HTML again. And so let me show you some more Emmet magic, okay? So we're gonna start with a div called composition, because that's what our component is going to be called. So composition. And now right from this Emmet abbreviation, I can actually continue writing it like this. So now I'm defining the children of this composition class. So what I want right now is to have an image with the class composition photo. So remember the BEM methodology. So this is the block and this is the element, and we have to repeat the name of the block in the class name for the element. So again, this is the element inside of the block. Now these 3 images that we're going to put here, they are completely different. So let me show you again. They are, for example, at different positions. And so we need for each of them also a modifier. Remember, so BEM stands for block, element, modifier. So we have the block, the element, and now let's also add a modifier. And so we add a second class. And in Emmet, in order to do that, we just use a second dot. So composition photo again. And then remember for the modifier, just dash dash, and then P1, which stands for photo or for picture 1, okay? All right, and now we want it 3 times. So we can just put parentheses around here, times 3, and now hit tab. All right, and here we go. So we have our div with the composition and then the 3 images with the composition photo class, the composition photo P1, and then we just have to change 2 and 3 here. But for now, let's just fill out these image sources here, okay? So img, and then this one is called net1, and actually not that one, so JPEG, okay? So now the alt, let's simply call it photo1 and not make a big deal out of this alt. And all I did now was to hit tab and it went to this next source definition here. So img net, and as you can guess, this one is going to be called the number 2. I hit tab again and it goes right to the next place where I want to write some text. So this is really smart, really intelligent. It knows what I want to do. I hit tab again, and this is the next place where I want to write some code, of course. And now the number 3. And now photo 3. And now let me just change this here, so 2 and 3. And that's our markup. So 3 images with 3 alt texts, they all share the same element class, then each of them will have a different